All right, everybody. We are very excited next to have a panel of local historians and preservationists and researchers of all different kinds. And once again, my name is Rita, Carr, and I'm the Director of Media and Communications for Nantucket Preservation Trust. And I'd like to start things off. I'll introduce all of our panelists by name, but I always like hearing about, people and what they do from themselves. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves. What are their research interests? How did you first wind up on Nantucket, or are you from here? Or just a little introduction for everyone. But we'll start off. First we have Michelle Elzay, Nikoline Bohr, Francis Karttunen, Betsy Tyler, Jascin Leonardo Finger, and Barbara White. So I'll ask Michelle to start things off.
Hi, everyone. So pleased to be here. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm an artist and interior designer, and sorry. I first came to Nantucket as a summer visitor when I was 3. And that was approximately 45 years ago, and around the time I was 9, I had fallen in love with Nantucket's federal architecture, and I was allowed to ride my bike into town, and I would go on the house tours over and over and over again. I was very popular in suburban Long Island as a 9-year-old with this dedicated interest. Most recently, I've been involved in historic preservation here on Nantucket. I restored a house, an 1810 house for my parents in 2010, and then later, my partner Penn Austin and I restored an 1834 house on Union Street. And through this house history, and the house itself revealed to us the property had been previously owned by a man named Essex Boston, who was born enslaved in Nantucket in 1741. He was manumitted on his 18th birthday. He became a wide landowner. There were numerous deed transactions in his name. And in doing the work, the preservation work of 55 Union, a trash pit was discovered that predated the 1834 house. And with these historic materials, I began working on a conceptual portrait of Essex Boston and his family, which is now part of the Outwin Portrait Competition at the National Portrait Gallery. I find it very exciting. I had not known that there were enslaved people in Nantucket before finding out about Essex Boston, as the previous speakers have also, revealed that these histories, as someone who was so fanatical as a child about learning about Nantucket, not knowing the full picture of the history here on the island. So I'm continuing my research and mapping of the neighborhood, and I'm also working on another project regarding folkloric magic and hidden tradition.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Nikoline?
I am a treasure hunter, an artist, a scientist, and a historian. I'm working on several projects. One of them is continuous, and it is focused on preserving and saving Nantucket's lost history through salvaging artifacts from construction sites and other places where the soil is being disturbed. With those artifacts, cataloging them, making them available for people to study in the future, and I also create art out of these artifacts, I do not create art out of the artifacts. I create art that represents the artifacts, which is then hung in the homes that they come from, in order to help people connect to the past and understand the history of their property. The other project I'm working on is about Nantucket's meridian stones. So I want to say it's about a year and a half ago, I began researching the history of Nantucket's meridian stones. And what I discovered is that they're far more significant to Nantucket's history, to saving the lives of sailors, cartography, than is currently understood. And yeah, so my focus is now to save them because they keep getting hit by cars also.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Frances Karttunen.
Good afternoon. I'm a 12th generation Nantucketer. My grandfather was a 10th generation descendant of the first English settlers here. And his grandfather was actually quite a distinguished whaling master. So there was that tradition in our family, lovingly maintained. But the fact of the matter is, my grandfather married an immigrant. My grandmother came here from Finland. And my grandfather died 20 years before I was born. And on the other hand, as the youngest of my grandmother's 8 grandchildren, I was very, very much in her company. And she told me a great deal about her life, her experience of trying to make her way into the Nantucket community. And we also maintained a very close relationship with our Finnish relatives, particularly in the post-World War II Reconstruction period, where they were very needy, and we did what we could to help. So I went to Nantucket High School, and if anybody had told me then that I would end up spending 30 years of my life in Central Texas, I would have said that was totally crazy. And if I had believed it, I would have taken Spanish rather than French in high school. Be that as it may. In the beginning of the 1970s, just when I was beginning my career as a linguist at the University of Texas at Austin, I also conceived of the book that I thought of as my retirement book. And I had the title from the beginning, The Other Islanders. And it was to be a book about all the people who were not the descendants of the English settlers, who had greatly contributed to the economy and the culture of Nantucket. And I knew that wasn't something that I could do from Texas. It had to be something I could only do when I came back home. But in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, whenever I was on Nantucket, I would go to the town clerk's office and I would ask for the death ledgers. And I went through the death ledgers noting everybody who was foreign-born or had foreign-born parents or was classified as non-white. And I created a big data file, which of course at that point was a shoebox file. So when I finally did retire from the University of Texas and came home, I began to write The Other Islanders. And the first part of The Other Islanders is called Nantucket's Peoples of Color. So the Wampanoags who were here when the English settlers got here, and the Africans who were here, who had been brought here, because there was nobody who ever woke up in Africa in the morning and said, I think I will go to Nantucket. All the Africans on Nantucket had been brought here. And we don't really have any records from the late 1600s, but from the beginning of the 1700s until very late in the 1700s, slavery existed on Nantucket. The latest deed of manumission that we have is 1775, when an elderly Quaker named Benjamin Coffin finally freed his 3 enslaved people. And then things switched, because from that point until the Emancipation Proclamation, Nantucket became a refuge from the Fugitive Slave Act. If people of color could make it to Nantucket, they could be fairly confident that they would not be taken into slavery. So that was the first part of the other islanders, and I think it's the significant part for today. The book also ends with people of color because the last part of it is about the restoration and opening to the public of the African Meeting House. So it's a long story.
Thank you. Up next, Betsy Tyler.
Hi. If you've not read Fran's book, The Other Islanders, I highly recommend it. It's a fabulous piece of research. I came to Nantucket about 40 years ago with a degree in library science and put my resume under my arm and walked into the Athenaeum and walked out again because there, was just no opportunity here at the time. But eventually the Historical Association hired me, and I have worked for the Historical Association off and on, also the Athenaeum, as a research librarian. So I met so many scholars and writers, historians, people who came to do research, and I would, lead them to the sources, the amazing resources that we have on this island. And I was so intrigued by so many of them that I decided I wanted to be on the other side of that reference desk. So I sort of left the library world and hung up my shingle as a researcher. And one of the first research jobs I got was with the NPT when they started a house marker program. And so I did deed research on probably 120 or so houses on the island, discovering, who owned them, who lived in them, any little bits of information I could. And then I wrote a couple neighborhood guides for the NPT as well. And then I've also done research in other areas of Nantucket history. I'm particularly interested in women's history on the island, and particularly women who went on whaling voyages with their husbands, which is kind of a unique little chapter in Nantucket history. So, I have a book about that, and a book about this, and I've been able to explore various aspects of Nantucket history. And in thinking about today and what we're all talking about, the research I do is in documentary sources. It's, I've explored the archives, personal narratives, every scrap of information that's out there. But I know there's another layer of history that cannot be told through those sources. And that's what we have to, figure out how to tell it through objects, to tell it through, through other sources. And that's the challenge. Thanks.
Up next is Jascin Leonardo Finger.
Hello. I am actually the curator of the Mitchell House at the Nantucket Mariah Mitchell Association. I'm also the deputy director at the organization. So I have worked for the organization for well over 35 years, I think it is. There were no more classes for me at the Mariah Mitchell Association, so my mother suggested I start to volunteer at the Mitchell House. And the poor curator at the time, her name was Laura Evans, welcomed me, thankfully. And as my mother says, she watched me walk in the door. I've never walked out. It has very much shaped my life and what I've done. I took a long time to go back to school to get my master's degree because I didn't want to leave Nantucket. So I found a program that I could only go off once a semester. Worked for me. And I got my master's degree in history with a focus on women and gender studies. So like Betsy, one of my interests is in Nantucket women. Obviously, I work in the house of Mariah Mitchell, America's first woman astronomer, so that does have an influence. And the Mariah Mitchell Association for 3 years actually shared me with the Egan Maritime Institute. And while I was working for Egan Maritime, I had the opportunity to mount 3 very different exhibitions. So I looked at fishing on the island, boat building on the island, and Nantucket women, with a focus on Mariah Mitchell, of course. But when they wanted me to really focus on Mariah, I said, but Mariah would want me to talk about all the other women who she lived with and who influenced her. And from that, my master's thesis was about Nantucket women, which I self-published probably about 10 years ago or so. So I still work in the area of Nantucket women, but there are other areas that interest me that I do research in, and of late, I never thought I was going to write or publish or anything like that. I've very much gotten into writing some short works of fiction, which are based on loosely here and there combining some of the women who I've come across over my studies. So if anybody knows a publisher, it's been a lot of fun. I never, when I was even early in college, I never really enjoyed writing, which I do now. So I'm really honored to be sitting here with all these fantastic women. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Barbara White, and I was a teacher here on the island for over 30 years. I've been here for 50 years. And I got a chance to take a sabbatical in the late 70s, and I went to Boston University in African American Studies, where I got my master's, and I wanted to do my paper, my history paper, on something on the island, and I had been teaching on the island for several years in a building called Cyrus Peirce. I didn't know anything about him, so I began casting about for a story that I could write for my master's program about Nantucket history, because I was commuting back and forth as best I could from the island. And so I began to research, and I've never really left the field of abolition, pre-Civil War, and Reconstruction. And in the process of doing my research at BU, I uncovered a story which was waiting in plain sight, as one of the historians said here today, that had not really been told in a contemporary fashion, which was about the struggle to integrate our schools before the Civil War. And it turned out to be quite an exciting story, with a riot, with a boycott, maybe the first boycott in American history of schools by parents, a very thrilling story. And so I got a Rockefeller grant because of it, and they funded my research, and it became a book. And I've never looked back. I obviously went back to teaching, but over the years, I began, whenever I could, scribbling down things like Fran does about Black history here, and abolitionists that were white who collaborated with the Black abolitionists. And I've had several books come out of that research. And that's where I am.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. And I also would like to thank Desiree Spriggs, who's the site manager for the Museum of African American History of Nantucket, who was supposed to join us today, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But I just wanted to give her a thank you as well. But we've heard a lot today, and even in just your introductions, we've talked a lot about sources, and Donna Marie was talking about looking for sources and being told that, oh no, you won't find that here, that doesn't exist. Have any of you had similar experiences in your research, or do you feel there are sources for Nantucket history that are underutilized?
I was asked to be a faculty advisor for a Nantucket teacher who was getting a degree from Lesley University in order to become a teacher instead of a teaching assistant. And she's Cape Verdean. And so she and I went together to the NHA Research Library and asked for what files they had about Cape Verdeans. And we were brought a folder which contained one piece of paper. She laughs about it to this day, but the fact of the matter is that now the NHA Research Library is very rich in material about Cape Verdeans.
So there are really no, if I'm correct, first-hand written accounts of the freed Black community in the 18th century here in Nantucket that I have come across. So in trying to reconstruct an idea of who Essex Boston might have been, I went into the future, and part of this also went to Betsy, who had initially asked me to write something on John B. Nicholson, who's the builder of the 1834 house. So I had been mapping the neighborhood, and in mapping the neighborhood into the future, I have developed an idea of what Essex Boston's surroundings might have been like. So it's almost a process of elimination to create a presence. in this case. And more things are popping up slowly but surely in Ancestry, and you have little clues here and there, but it's sort of taking very disparate parts to try and bring them together to create an idea of a family.
Yeah, I think that, it isn't always the easiest thing, but you just keep digging. I think that it's perseverance, it's keeping notes, it's knowing, for example, I came across a serendipitous bunch of petitions at the State House in Boston just by really sheer luck. And because I knew the names of the African Americans here, when the petition first dropped on the ground, the first one that I picked up, and I saw Absalom Boston's name, Eunice Ross's name, people that I had begun to flesh out, that, if I hadn't known those names, that would have just been a petition to me. So I think that as a researcher, you have to really look widely, especially if you're researching people who are underserved in the society pages for sure, but you begin to look for certain clues of language that you might not notice, like you might go into a graveyard and see a C in front of the cavalry, like we have up at the historic colored burial ground, and then you would say, oh, well, that means he was a colored cavalryman. What is his story? So you have to begin to look at the language people use. People didn't necessarily come out and use the words black or colored back then, but they might use another phrase that if you've been reading the records long enough, you say, aha, that is a coding for that. And you have to keep digging, and you have to have colleagues. I mean, all three of us on the stage here are Nantucket Research Fellows, and we share things. And sometimes things serendipitous happen. I was down in Camden, North Carolina, trying to research a woman who was from a Nantucketer who went south during Reconstruction to start schools for black teachers. And I went to this one archive, and the guy said, we don't have anything here. And I began looking around. I found a few things, not much, but I left him a sticky note with my name on it. And about a year later, a researcher from Georgia called me and said, I have information that from a sticky note. And so I think that really becomes our trademark, is we are just diggers.
I think too, I'm a curator by nature, and there are within the kind of museum and archive world, there are two different beasts. There's a curator and there's an archivist. And I was naive enough to assume that I knew, I had some issues, but I was at a meeting with a bunch of other museum people, and it was about archives, and pretty much everyone was in the room was a curator, because the presenter said, now all you curators out there, you can't mark every piece of paper. Because in my world, every single object has a number on it that corresponds to information. But in the archive, it's a general kind of number with a general gist. So as Barbara was saying, you have to be willing to read and to dig, and to also keep things planted in your head or on a sticky note, because you never know when you're going to need it again. And it also helps to have great research librarians and others. There was a woman who used to work for the NHA's research library, Ralph, who would always bring me things of, I know you asked for this, this, and this, but this might also have something. This was next to this. This was in this. So also having relationships, if you can build them, with the people that work there, because then they'll remember that sticky note that you left a year behind and pass it on to somebody else.
And I think Ralph is actually watching our live stream, so shout out to her. So there's so many myths and misconceptions about Nantucket history. Are there any that sort of stick at you the most, that you find most prevalent, that you wish you could just completely dispel once and for all?
I have to jump in here, because when I was with the NHA, we did an exhibit on just that, on busting some myths about Nantucket. And once something's in print, it's really hard to erase it as incorrect. And so you keep running across these same stories. And my favorite one, and this is kind of really off topic a little, there was a book written, it became a very popular little children's book about the cheese that Nantucket made back and sent to Lafayette as a gift, a 500-pound cheese. And, people believe this story that everybody on Nantucket took the milk from their cows in a 24-hour period, and they made this giant cheese, and they shipped it to France, to Lafayette. So, how do you bust that myth? And so I found out about cheese making and how much milk that would take, and then how many cows were actually on the island at this period in Nantucket history. And, anyway, Lafayette did visit the United States later, after this supposed cheese had been sent to him, and the people on Nantucket were debating whether they should invite him to come visit or not. This isn't a man's personal narrative, and they decided not to. So I don't think they ever sent him a cheese. But it's that kind of myth that becomes popular, and these popular stories that are really hard to dispel. They're kind of fun, but they're not true, and there are many of them.
I don't know if Fran's going to jump in on this one, but I think one of the things that we probably both get asked a fair amount, or the assumption that all Quakers were abolitionists, or that Nantucket was a hotbed of abolitionism. It was not. A lot of Quakers were not abolitionists. A lot of Quakers had, especially those that were more for the inner light, didn't believe in getting involved in politics. And yes, we had our share of outspoken abolitionists here, but they were never, ever in the majority, and they were always seen as the radical or the outcasts. And so there's often been an assumption on Nantucket that we were this, beacon of hope and all of that. And it is true that people of color could come here and make a living and be safe from being recaptured, but we were not as advertised. I think we're not as, I don't know. You get that one too, I know.
Well, there's the myth that everybody was a Quaker on Nantucket too, and it was founded by Quakers, which is totally untrue.
Yeah, there's even a myth that the first settlers here that Nantucket was founded by Quakers, and I have to keep saying no. Not long after I'd published The Other Islanders, another Nantucketer who is more theatrically oriented stated that all the stories of Nantucket's black folks were lost, and so we have to make up stories for them. And I just want to scream, no, we must not make up stories. Actually, it's true that for the 1700s, things are a little thin, but for the 1800s, the documentation, including documentation by the people themselves, is rich. And it just makes me cringe to think that we're going to make up stories and then propagate them. I don't think we should do that.
Right. So I'd love to talk more about material culture and what we can learn from objects and from buildings. And Michelle and Nikoline in particular, since you're often working with found objects, when you come across something, what is your process for, finding out more information, for putting it more in, historical context?
So it all begins with where you find it. So the way I work, everything is usually in a big pile of dirt. But you can still begin to tell where that dirt came from initially. Was it dug from over there? Was it scraped from over here? Both by checking the colors in the color of the actual dirt to the color of the ground where it was removed from, or just understanding how it was moved. From there on, you find the objects, verify their age, and I keep everything from every site separate. Well, not separate from that site, but separate from other sites. I'm currently working on several coffee table books, which will include all the found objects for each property. And from there, you can begin to piece together how people use each area of the land based on what items were found there at different, or what items from each time period were found there.
Well, so there's the work of historic preservation and the building itself, which is one thing, but then the other thing of working with, the Essex-Boston objects were found by salvage archaeology, so it's not systematic. The pipes were the first clue. They were more easily datable, that the deposits predated the 1834 house. It also went under the neighbor's property. And then you just need to research. With the items that are found sort of hidden in the walls of houses, it becomes even more complicated in the sense that, for instance, shoes that have been hidden within walls, there's a long history of this, but the shoes are used and worn out by the time they are concealed. So, for instance, a pair of shoes that I found on a property on York Street, which would have been Maiden Lane, which would have been Essex-Boston's closest neighbor. The house was being gutted, the shoes had fallen from by the front door. They were in the wall, and there was eelgrass insulation there, and the eelgrass insulation, from a material standpoint, in terms of historic preservation, was interesting. We had some at 55 Union Street, and I thought, oh, Penn and Brian Pfeiffer are going to want to hear about this. So I take a photo of it, and I look more carefully, and I see these shoes that had fallen down. The shoes are a little tricky to date, but then I did the house history, and it really seemed to me that they were placed within the walls of the house when it was built in 1795 as an initial protective device there. So it's a little bit of guesswork and a little bit of research, and a little bit of storytelling to kind of make it come together, but it's also conjecture too. I hope I know that what I'm saying is true, but it's open to other historians also who might know more.
Anybody else? Jason, as a curator, do you have any favorite objects or?
So, at the Mitchell House, about 85% of the artifacts are original to either Mariah's family, her uncle's family, or Mariah herself. The house has been a museum since 1902. We opened our doors in 1903. So we're unusual. We have no running water, no electricity. The house has not been, I'll say, fiddled with in any way. It's all the original plaster. The kind of problem that we run into at the Mitchell House is that I'm not making them sound like a problem, but the first curators were Mariah's cousins and her cousins' daughters. So a lot of the information that we would have would be information that was passed down through them. So on occasion, we run into a problem of, is this entirely true? Or when I was working with Margaret Moore Booker, when she was working on the Mariah Mitchell biography Among the Stars, Margaret's mantra that started to drive me crazy and drive her crazy was always, well, how do you know that? Is it written down anywhere? And I'd be like, no. It was passed to me, because I've been there so long, by other curators who had come before, who had learned, like Edith Andrews, from those cousins. So you have to try and, I guess you want to sometimes take it with a grain of salt. You're hoping that it's true, because in some cases, Mariah's fingerprints, she literally came into the house when she was an older person and told her cousins, I stuck my fingers in here. And then they were able to tell everybody else that that's where she put her fingers. So you run into things like that, or you run into, dead ends, like the telescope that she discovered the comet with. We're not really 100% sure how William acquired it. And, was he loaned it? Her sister talks a little bit about it, but did he purchase it? Or was it a payment for some of the work he was doing? So there's things like that. But every one of those pieces tells a story. They're just, even down to the smallest thing, even if they don't even belong to the family, like there's these lovely clothespins, I know this sounds crazy, that we have in the 1825 kitchen. And I wrote a blog about it maybe last year or the year before, but somebody took the time to take this utilitarian item and to just delicately carve or trace a circle into the, into the upper part to just make it something a little bit more. So I think it's just looking at things in different ways and how somebody was caring for it. I mean, if I'm putting my laundry on the line every time and then seeing this, how somebody is just, my husband or my father has carved it like that, all these little pieces say something about the people who made them and the people who use them. And it's also getting people to get excited about the things that we get excited about, like something like that, a clothespin.
I think documents are also things. And I think one of the things that a lot of us who are older up here have got to touch real documents in a way that sometimes historians maybe not get to do so as much recently. On the other hand, digitization has been an eye-opener. When I first found the petitions that changed my life, they were just in a file that had been forgotten. Now they're all digitized. They're up online. Anyone can find them. They don't have to be in that spot. And we've all benefited from that. I was researching the Freedmen's Bureau, some aspects of it, and I went to the University of Virginia that was one of only 5 places where they had a repository of all the records of the Freedmen's Bureau. And under President Clinton, he had them put on microfilm or film, and which is terrible to use. I hope nobody ever has to do microfilm again. But there, at the University of Virginia, they had rows and rows of these documents which had been put on microfilm that would have all been lost. And I was fortunate to find a file of the woman I was researching and go through her weekly reports for years and years and find out when she was absent, which led to why was she absent, and again, it's that digging. But digitization, now a lot of those records are online. And Massachusetts is being really great because we have a digital archive of petitions about slavery, anti-slavery petitions that are just a gold mine for every community in Massachusetts. And that did not exist when some of us started our work.
Add one more thing to what Barbara just said too, is at the Mariah Mitchell Association, we have all of Mariah's papers. And when she died, she passed them to her younger sister, Phoebe. Some of them Mariah had scrapbooked herself. Some of them Phoebe had scrapbooked. But in the conservation world, some conservators who want to conserve those pieces want to take apart all of the scrapbooks. But the scrapbook itself is important as well because Mariah made it, her sister made it, so it's a document, or not a document, it's an artifact in itself. So that's also the struggle. So as long as I'm curator, they're going to stay in their scrapbooked form. They were microfilmed many years ago, and we have since been able to transfer that to scanning the microfilm itself, which is helpful. But there's also a struggle for smaller organizations to digitize. I know I worked with a group through the Schlesinger Library. It was a lot of different women's organizations, and we were working together to come up with this grant, a federal grant, to have the papers digitized for all these really famous women, including Mariah, Annie Jump Cannon, you name it. We applied 3 times, and we didn't get the funding. So, and it was a treasure trove of women scientists. It was kind of a no-brainer, even on the first round. But we didn't get it, so we still struggle with that kind of thing as well. But that kind of goes back to me as a curator, is that scrapbook idea being important as its own self as well.
Yeah, and I'll have to say the same thing goes for whaling logbooks and journals. I've read many of them, but particularly women's journals. The book itself, the journal that you hold in your hand, has been on a ship for 4 years. It's been to all the places that the person writes about. This artifact has traveled there, and it gives it, it gives it some magic, because when you sit down and open it and you're reading the words that somebody wrote while they were at sea or while they were in some foreign island, someplace that was exotic and unknown to them, it takes on a whole other level of meaning, and it's pretty important to have that.
So we've talked a lot today, how Nantucket, we're, a small island 30 miles out at sea, but there's all these connections to the wider world, and we've, stories that resonate, similarities with Martha's Vineyard in the east end of Long Island. So have you found any, a favorite sort of maybe surprising connection to somewhere else in your research at all? Or any, in general, maybe something that just surprised you, an exciting find?
I don't know if it'd be exciting to other people, but there's a few things that come to mind. So people don't realize just how Mariah Mitchell and her family kind of spread out throughout the great minds and thinkers of the 19th century. I mean, you name the person, Mariah Mitchell, her father, her siblings were friends with them. We have a red rose pressed in a scrapbook that came from John Greenleaf Whittier. We just have all these amazing things, and sometimes I'm like the only one who knows about them, which is a little sad. But she traveled to Europe, met Harriet Hosmer, you name the astronomers, she met them. But then there's small things too, like years and years ago when I was working on the exhibition about Nantucket women, I was researching one person in particular, and I really felt like she had this connection to another person. It was like, the kind of thing, talked a lot, you didn't really know, but it was like, and then it was actually Suzanne Gardner and we came across this one little bit, and we realized that they were a couple. And I don't remember who else was in the research library. I don't think it was anybody from Nantucket, but the two of us were jumping up and down, all excited, like screaming in the middle of the research library, because we had made this, had actually made this connection and it was just really exciting. And it's stuff like that, when you get that, even if it's the tiniest little nugget, it's just exciting. I don't know how else to express it. And you feel like they're there. See, I'm that kind of person who I feel like all the people who have been a part of my life, even Mariah in some ways, I always feel like they're there, that at that moment, those two women, they might have been like, ooh, but we didn't want you, but they were there. It's just something that you continue on, people become a piece of you, and you continue to spread that message, and it's so important to understand where we came from, where we're going, and also why things were done a certain way. And it's just, I will always remember that moment with Suzanne. It was just really exciting. She was an amazing person herself. And always very helpful too when she was at the research library.
I mean, in saying that, in even touching these, I find this incredible. Now I'm like, there's not a construction site that's safe if I don't want to stick my nose around to see what pottery shards are there. And in some ways, it can become a comparative analysis of who had what in what area of town. But then in repeatedly touching even just parts of objects, you start to feel this physical connection to your subject, your family, what they were eating off of, what they were smoking, what drugs they were doing, what their food was being stored in, and it becomes a very tangible. It's like you're accumulating relatives, really, and that they become a part of your larger family. And I do think this is the point of it becomes part of our larger global family, of our establishers of our country, of our values, of all of it, and you do feel a very physical connection to that. That is magical. Yeah, through their trash or whatever it was, and that, my Ancestry account, Ancestry has a family tree that I'm working on for personal research, and then the Boston family tree. And I think if the Mormons are analyzing, they're like, she has very interesting family background here. But you accumulate relatives.
And I mean, to the extent of getting to know people from the past, you also begin to realize how near the past is. I mean, the past wasn't that long ago. The past was yesterday, and it is still here. What happened then is still affecting us now. And to that extent, it reminds you how important it is to look to the future and make sure that that is something we're taking care of.
We tend, though, from our perspective, to project back on the past. Quite unconsciously, we think, well, it's the way it is now, it's the way it always has been. And when I was growing up in Nantucket, there were about 3,500 year-round people. And except for a few shut-ins and maybe a few really antisocial people, I knew every one of them by face, at least, knew who it was. And all the children in Nantucket schools at that time, with very few exceptions, had been born here. So it's really, really changed in the last 20 years. But I think at that time, we projected back on the 1800s and even the 1700s, that sense of about how big the population of Nantucket was and the fact that it was all local born, it was very homogeneous. And then when I began to do the research, I discovered that we were really the product of the Depression. From before and through the Depression until the 50s, not many people were coming here because there was no reason, there was no work. And so naturally we were all born here and we were all pretty much cousins. But Nantucket was a very cosmopolitan place during whaling era and even afterwards. There were all sorts of people here, and one of the biggest surprises for me were how many Pacific Islanders were on and off of Nantucket. I think we had completely forgotten that there ever were, Melville has Ishmael meet Queequeg in New Bedford and talks about the cannibals on the corners in New Bedford, but then when he comes to Nantucket, he doesn't say anything about it. But in fact, we had a lot of Pacific Islanders coming and going from Nantucket, and as far as I can tell, that was totally forgotten.
And I wanted to follow up on something, Jascin, you said earlier when you were talking about thinking you had this slam dunk funding proposal and not having it funded. Is that something others of you have found, researching Black history and women's history and the history of immigrants, that there's less funding?
One of the challenges we all face up here is we are local historians, and local historians, we don't have graduate students to help us work, we don't have access to university presses. Many of us up here struggle to get our work in print, and it's a loss to the country because some of our previous speakers talked about, like on the Vineyard, Fran and I know one of the researchers over there, and which is now contributing to work that is bigger. And a challenge for us all is getting funding and publishing. I mean, I've had to self-publish a work which would have been a much better book had I gotten an editor for it and not self-published. The research I know is solid and it needs to be out there, but you don't get it spread out. So we have all these histories all over Sag Harbor, and they don't always get connected into a bigger whole. So I would just like to make a plug for some sort of local press support, because you have your story that should be published, and you have your stories from the Vineyard that need to be published, and they just don't get out there unless they're in journals like the Nantucket History, Historic Nantucket on here, but it doesn't get a wide readership. And so I'd say that's one of the struggles we all face, is getting funding for our works.
And distribution.
Yeah, I completely agree. So the paper, I wrote this really long paper, not really long, it's long, paper on the Meridian stones and all about how they were influential in that time period. And I have a summary of it published with American Surveyors, which is awesome, and I am so grateful to American Surveyors for having published that. However, I would love to also have a local publication or similar, where I could publish the full length, because there are so many details that are so interesting and relate to Nantucket history that I couldn't fit into the summary article. So absolutely, it is so important.
This circles back to an earlier question about prejudices and ideas of Nantucket. I think that Nantucket historically was very important globally in the 18th and 19th century. And now we are perceived as an elite playground. And the history, why I believe it's so important, is because it locates itself within the national context and is therefore important. And this is something that came up that, you know, it's almost being held against Nantucket that it has good beaches, basically. You know, I mean, so something gets a little lost in translation, maybe.
Was there anybody else for Fran, I thought? Oh, all right, never mind. Well, at this point, I'd love to open it up for questions for the panel from the audience, if anyone has any at this point. Alyssa is
One myth I found particularly amusing. I went around with the notion that Brotherhood of Thieves was a pirate ship. And after doing the research and discovering it was actually the riot that happened at the Athenaeum on the second conference of abolitionists, and then going back and looking at the sign of the Brotherhood, where they actually sanitized the logo completely. It was that original drawing, but they sanitized the logo and took off the person of color and put a tie on the pastor. It was extremely enlightening, and it was even more so enlightening that the selectmen actually sanctified that revolt. And it was, when I was reading this, was exactly happening when the Capitol riots happened. And it was just crazy.
It was, that sign was one of the original sign, which showed a man with a clerical collar and horns, and in his different hands, one hand had money and the other an enslaved mother and child. And behind the scene was a windmill, which made you know it was on Nantucket. It was from a speech by radical abolitionist Stephen Foster called the Brotherhood of Thieves speech, in which he went, which he did not just speak on Nantucket. It was part of a traveling abolitionist show, if you will, that traveled around New England. And in it, he was very inflammatory, especially against the churches, because churches in the North had churches affiliations in the South. And so he accused ministers, pointing them out in the audience, as purveyors, pimps of Satan, which is shocking to say today, perhaps, but it was incredibly shocking in the 1840s. And so that's where the sign comes from. And I used to cut it out for my 7th and 8th graders and ask them to analyze it, like, what is that man? And it would take them a while to come up with a minister. Well, why does a minister have horns? And always led to a discussion. So when I saw that they had sanitized the sign, I was horrified to think that we've taken that piece of significant history out of Nantucket, which is not a wonderful bit of history. It's doesn't necessarily reflect highly on the island. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that.
There are actually 2 steps in the sanitization, because first of all, they said no clerical collar, just an ordinary tie. But the enslaved people and the money bags continued until recently, and now they're gone.
Yeah.
I thought it was also interesting that they actually called the abolitionists anti-Christian, and they used that avenue to actually demonize them too.
I just want to make a quick comment about the Pacific Islanders on Nantucket. The whales very quickly learned to avoid the sound of oars rowing in their direction that contained sharp, deadly things. So the Pacific Islanders could paddle silently, so they could better sneak up on the whales.
I just have like a question of like, is there a location on the island that like piqued your personal interest, like it made a lasting impression on you that you wanted to like look into it more? And has there been any discoveries that have like either reaffirmed your initial perception of that site or even like completely altered what you thought it could have been?
Well, I feel like every site is interesting because there's always a story, and that you never really know what story it is until you look into it. So to that extent, I think every story uncovered is a fantastic story, and it's always surprising, and it's always it's just unexpected usually. To that extent, I mean, obviously I was interested in the Meridian stones and uncovering more about how they were influential during the mid-1800s is definitely a really cool story. It's super cool. Yeah.
I think Barbara should say something about the historic colored cemetery.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize, though. Two places come to my mind. One is the historic colored cemetery, which when I didn't discover it, people knew it was there, but it had been overgrown and was a place where people partied. And for years, I would say to my middle school students, if anybody wants some extra credit, because I didn't have the time to document the stones up there, and I got 4 8th graders to go up to the cemetery and document every stone and what it said. And they were so diligent that they would sometimes come in the morning and you say, Mrs. White, I went up early morning. The light is different. You can read more. And then they went to the the select board, and they petitioned the town to renovate and clear the cemetery, keep fencing around it now, and now it's a site people can visit. So that chokes me up. The other one that any of you who have not been to the African Meeting House, to me it's sacred ground. Those of us that have been here a long time know that it became very deteriorated and was like a bicycle repair shop. And when I wrote my book about the Meeting House in the late 70s, it was falling apart. And a group of people on Nantucket formed a group called the Friends of the Meeting House, and we Jeannie Duart, some of you may remember her, was our treasurer. And we began collecting money, and we didn't know what was going to happen because the NHA didn't want the building because it was in such disrepair, and they don't want to take on buildings that are going to cost them millions of dollars. And eventually, the Meeting House in Boston took it upon themselves to renovate it. And so when I go in there, I mean, literally, I just get shivers up my spine to think about how close we came to losing it, talking about preservation, and the history that was there, because it was a meeting house. It's where people had vaccinations. It's where they had a school. They had funerals. They had marriages. It was the beating heart of the community. And I'm so grateful that we have it. There was another church, but it was not saved, and that was long since up Mill Hill. So I really feel like I'm talking too much.
So I actually have a question with respect to the colored cemetery. So I don't know, are you familiar with there's a lot right next to it, and it has a lot of square granite stones in it. They're all set flush to the ground, and if you follow them, you'll begin to notice that they're in patterns. So they're like one shape is a large oval, for example.
You mean between the cemetery and Vesper Lane?
So you have the hospital, and then you have the cemetery, and then here's that path. That's the dirt path that goes around the. Here's the helicopter, here's the cemetery, and here's a big field.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's in here.
Yeah, that was privately owned and donated fairly recently. So whatever those granite stones in the ground are, had to do with the previous owner.
Okay.
I was told, and this could be totally wrong, but there are daffodils planted in those. You'll see them in the
really?
spring, and
Yeah.
it may be just
Cool.
to delineate a
Got
flower
it.
bed. Yeah,
Don't mow here.
don't know.
Can I just, sorry, I think that's one thing too to, I guess, is being highlighted as Barbara especially is talking, is that that's another thing that gets kind of somewhat ignored to some extent, are cemeteries and how important those are. I do spend a lot of time in our cemeteries, particularly Prospect Hill. I do a stone monument cleaning workshop every spring. And you learn a lot about people when you start to unveil what's on their stones. Can you make sure your mic is on? Great button. Did I hit it? I'm sorry, I hit it.
Probably me.
Did you hear what I said, or do you want me to repeat what I said?
The people online did not hear what you
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's just the importance of the cemeteries and the stones and what you learn from them. And I was just saying how I spend a lot more time in cemeteries, which I think some people, for lack of a better word, think is creepy. But cemeteries are quite beautiful. And I spend time cleaning some of the stones. And I do that as a workshop.
Well, speaking of cemeteries, I wrote a book about a whaling family who the wife gave birth to a child on the voyage, and the child lived to be 13 months old and then died. And so the family did not want to bury her in Tahiti where they were, or bury her at sea, so they had her embalmed in a little lead casket, which was on board the ship for 3 years till they got back to Nantucket. And I have found her gravestone in the Newtown Cemetery, a little white marble stone that says Mary Frances Veeder, who died at Tahiti, and it has a little tiara flower engraved on it. And it's just, it's just so moving to find that's part of that story.
Barbara and I are both cemetery commissioners, so we spend a lot of time thinking about cemeteries, and I find very moving the Quays Asylum burial ground. It was nearly lost twice in the 20th century. The town bought a farm, and they moved people who were, for one reason or another, unable to support themselves. Quite a few of them were just so aged that, and anyone who might have taken care of them had passed on already. Some had disabilities. Undoubtedly, some had other kinds of deficits, but it wasn't an insane asylum. It was an asylum for the indigent. And it was in Quays. And over the years that it existed, 317 people died there. It was documented. I mean, this is over a big chunk of the 1800s. But most of the people who died in the asylum were then buried in one of the town cemeteries in a family plot or on their own property somewhere on the island. There was this little field in which oral history says that 17 residents of the asylum were buried. And I've been able to document 12 of them. So they were buried in unmarked graves, and there was a fence, but by the late 1800s, when Pulpus Road was rerouted, the fence was gone, but the town bell ringer of the day, James Gibbs, placed a concrete bound at each corner of this little cemetery. And then, a generation went by, and his son, in the actual last month of his life, told people about the cemetery, took people there, and they located the 4 concrete bounds that had been set in the 1880s. And if that man had not been able to do that, if he hadn't gathered people and said, this is important, and we can still find it, that cemetery would have been lost. The Conservation Foundation came to own the entire area in which the cemetery is, and we've been told that they were not all that happy to learn that they owned a cemetery. But we have, as a cemetery commission, we've been maintaining it, we've marked it, we've put cedar fencing at each of the corners, and just a month ago, we put a monument there with the names and the dates of everybody I've been able to document. So perhaps there are 5 more people in that cemetery that I haven't been able to find out about, but certainly now, at last, the 12 people are documented on a monument, and that's not going to ever get lost again.
That's amazing.
Thank you, everyone. This was really great, and I want to talk to all of you and stay in touch. It feels like the work that you're doing here of incorporating the history of all the people and keeping it alive and moving it forward to next generations and all the different levels of study that you're doing is really fabulous. And I agree that it's so hard to find that funding or to find that connection. But I think more and more locations and historical places are connecting with other similar historic places who are doing the same kind of research to sort of make collectives. I'm part of something, well, Sylvester Manor and Plainside Project are part of something called the Northern Slavery Collective, which is a group of New York sites from the Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island. And we're history professionals, which now I get to call myself a history professional. And we meet regularly just to talk about how we tell the stories, ideas for programming, ways to move forward, things to do collaboratively, and most importantly, ways to fund the work that we're doing. And it's a big help. It's so much fun to sort of talk to other people who are doing the same kind of work that you're doing, you know, with the same enthusiasm, who basically talk your language, if you know what I mean. And we really are starting to move ahead collectively to figure out how we can, as a group, find that money that we all need to move forward, as well as connecting to colleges and universities. Because more and more what we're finding is that those big foundation funders are looking for history in place, like the work that we all are doing, and how to connect that to higher learning. So in other words, the work that you're doing here on all kinds of different levels of the African American history here, the history of women, the history of your cemeteries and burial grounds in relation to whaling or whatever, to find a partnership with a university who would then send their graduate students to help you do the research, to create courses around the work that you're doing so that it's collaborative. What you get is funding for it and actual worker bees to come in, and graduate students to come and do the internships. So I think my point is, I think there are opportunities. I think we have to just start really thinking outside the box because the work that you do and that I'm doing is so important to move this forward to the future and for the present, because as you said, the past is not that long ago. And it does influence all of us. And being able to say that this history of this place is inclusive has so much meaning for where we are today. So thank you very much, all of you, for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Donna Marie. Do we have any more questions? Oh, yes, okay.
I just wanted to mention a resource that maybe has been alluded to but hasn't been specifically mentioned this afternoon. And that is when I learned of a great resource, which is a privy. Now this is really the story that's untold, that's underground, and it's not a cemetery. But it is, I think, a resource that gets overlooked greatly. And with funding through the Community Preservation Act during the restoration of the Boston Higginbotham House on York Street for the Museum of African American History, we did have a a university. We did have UMass Fisk Archaeological Center come, and it was wonderfully scheduled in with the restoration work so that they went 8 feet down, and then I learned that a privy was a treasure trove, and thousands upon thousands of artifacts came. And working with Professor David Landon from UMass was an amazing, enlightening experience for me, working in restoration as an architect all these years, and how adamant they were that we tell the story of the house not just through the architecture, but through what was underground. And there are many, many students at this time. All of those artifacts are at UMass in Boston. And there are graduate students doing studies that are integrating with the Boston family, that are telling us things that no document exists to tell us, but they are studying and digging, and it's an amazing resource that maybe private homeowners don't have the opportunity or the wherewithal to be aware that you could stop, you could have tremendously great amount of information come forth before you excavate, before you move the house, before just take a look at even what is even almost on the surface. But you know that we didn't have indoor plumbing until maybe 100 years ago here, so there are a lot of privies to be discovered. Thank you.
All right, and Alyssa.
So question for Michelle. So if you happen to come across a bunch of artifacts, hypothetically speaking, if you were digging, how would you go about sort of collecting them as you were uncovering them, knowing full well that at the completion of a project or at, when you're done, you've got boxes of stuff that have come out of the ground. What do you do with them?
Well, the contents of the cistern from 55 Union Street are in the crawl space of 55 Union Street. The Essex-Boston material is, right now, it's in my storage in New York, but it will come back to Nantucket. But they're just, lovingly stored in layers. It's up to the homeowner, I suppose, to keep them. It's tricky with these. I, of course, love all these things like they're prized possessions, and then to someone else's eye, they're scraps of trash. Mm-hmm. So, it's on us to import the meaning and take care of them, I think, right?
Yeah.
If you found quite a few things on your property, yeah, and it's up to you to kind of keep them.
I guess my question is more of how do you store them in the interim? What's the best way to keep them? What's the best way to keep them safe in terms of because you're lots and lots of shards and things and items and stuff, and short of just stacking them in boxes on piles and knowing full well, I have 50 layers of wallpaper on boards, and
wow.
You peel each one off, and I've found antique books on wallpaper. I don't have the time to research it right now, but it's a lot of things like that. And for me, it's very important to keep them with the house, but it's sort of like the project that happens when the house is done, sort of thing.
Yeah, giant Tupperware. I have a little story I'll say really quickly. I know someone who lost her family home in Katrina. She's from Mississippi. And her mother was a very good carer of the family archive. And all of the stuff was in these giant, big plastic Tupperwares. And the roof had blown off. And the water level had pushed all of the Tupperware into the rafters of the house. So the roof went sailing off. It was found 1.5 miles from the location of the house with all of the family archives still intact in it. Wow. It's an amazing story. Quite by happenstance.
Yeah, I think Tupperware is great. Beyond that, you probably want to keep the stuff free of moisture. If you have those little packets, it's good practice to put stuff in separate bags so every item has its own bag. Label it so people, say something were to happen to you, someone else were to find it, then they can know where it came from and what it is. And obviously, just keep it free of moisture and don't squish it, and so on.
Yeah, I would document where you took it from within
Yeah.
the house, but also there are resources out there for the museum archive people, Gaylord Brothers, University Products, that have special containers that you can purchase that are specifically they're making them for those things now too. So it's not just for people in the museum field. Anybody can use them. I know my family makes fun of me because if I scrapbook like something for my son, I use, acid-free this, acid-free that, special glue, all that kind of thing. And, all my paintings are labeled in my house where they came from. But that's if I pop off, then people will know what was the reason for it. But I think it would be good too. You can interleave, you can buy folds, all kinds of stuff, but I think it's good to document too if you can. I know if you just take a few moments when you find something to document where it came from. But it's also getting future, whoever lives in your house after you, to understand it's important. It goes with the house. It needs to stay with the house. There are people on island, who are like, I want to put up these shutters that I found in my basement. And they're shutters from the late 19th century that all the previous owners kept. And so, that's kind of understanding that the things that come with your house should stay with your house because they help tell the story and they're an integral part of that.
But I think we also need to make a plug for donating things to local museums if they're of significance, so that they get kept for everyone and not just for individual homeowners. So I think there has to be a judgment call made there sometimes on, if anybody finds a diary of Anna Gardner, I sure want it.
Keeping stuff in a private collection, long run, is definitely not the ideal situation. But you can photograph things and, in that sense, have an inventory available for research and start there if you want to keep the stuff with the home. So you can start by just taking pictures of everything and just making that available.
All right, do we have any more questions from the audience? All right, well, thank you all so very much for being part of the panel.